Good morning. Good morning. Great to see everyone here this morning. I was just going to open up my phone and look at the bulletin so I'd know who to mention that was on the sick list. And the first thing I run across is an update on Patricia's mother and sister. And I'm just going to read it to you because you probably came in just 30 minutes ago, now an hour ago, I guess now. It says, "Good morning. My sister needs 2, possibly 3 surgeries. Gallbladder removal, kidney stone laser blasted, and possibly surgery on sinus. She was given new medicine for migraine. She tried it Friday night and then had weird feeling migraine Saturday, so no help there. My mother still hasn't found out what's causing her to need blood transfusions. She's feeling bad again. She had a colonoscopy a little while back and they had to stop because her heart rate got too low and there was a blockage. She needs to see a gastroenterologist soon to see what need to do. She's still dealing with nerve damage behind her eye and on her head from having shingles a few months back. So please continue praying for them. Thanks so much." So that is a definite need there that we need to keep those in our prayers. Brother Terry had his visit to the doctor this past Friday and had some good news, but also he's still got his kidney stone and he said if he grimaces a few times this morning, we'll know what's going on. But need to keep him in our prayers. I think he said this Friday, if he hasn't passed it by Friday, he makes another visit. Remember Marion Nixon that fell, Miranda's aunt that fell and broke her arm. Blakely Johnson, a friend of the Mays, the 3-year-old that's undergoing cancer treatment. And also we need to keep Dave's parents in our thoughts and prayers, those out in Texas that are going through things. Have I missed anyone? Yes, I did. My son is with us today. His words are, "I'm functional." He's not feeling great. He's dealing with upper respiratory, and for Holly had her carpal tunnel surgery last Tuesday, and this time they managed to do it laparoscopically, and she's coming along mending well on that. So, but Jay's just not feeling. He's been down for a week now, so keep him in your prayers. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Abby fell down the steps and broke 3 bones in her hand.
Abby fell. Okay, let me get it straight. I know it starts with an A. Amy fell and broke 3 bones in her hand. Okay.
My son is not doing too good today.
Dennis. Okay. Anyone else?
Did you mention Blakely?
I did.
I had to go outside. Okay.
I did.
I think she's still undergoing treatments.
Okay.
Oh, okay, that's all I have.
Brother Kyle, would you lead us in a prayer, please, before we begin class?
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day that we have come before you to study from your word, to learn more about specifically Daniel this morning. Father, be with those who've been mentioned today as they'll please restore them to their health. Father, we ask that you give them each your peace to deal with the issues that they have to deal with. Father, we ask that each one be healed. Help us to focus our minds during these hours of Bible study and worship to you, Father, that we may be pleasing to you. Help us to honor you in the way that you deserve to be honored. Father, help us to always be looking to see how we can advance your kingdom and how we can grow the number of Christians in the world. Father, we ask that you help us to focus our minds at this time. Forgive us of any sins that may have committed against you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
And I did forget one, Myra, that has her foot surgery coming up. Or anybody got an update on her? 10th of December, right? Yeah, scheduled for the 10th of December. So Daniel chapter 6. At the close of last week's lesson, we had mentioned that Darius was the Mede that had came in and taken Babylon, Cyrus being the Persian king at the time. At that point, Belshazzar was killed. So at the close of chapter 5, we can say that the Babylonian kingdom was no longer in existence. And all of this had been prophesied by Isaiah and all 150 years before this. But that's what brings us down to this point. So, and as we also said last week, chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 are not in chronological order. It should be 7, 8, 5, 6, but we've gone through 5, and now we're going to go through 6. Now when we get to 7, we'll back up a little bit. Also, last week, Brother Golden had mentioned about the capture. We'd talked just a little bit about how Babylon was captured. I think there's a little discussion on it. There's a couple of different ideas, but the main one, and it seems like archaeology backs up the one where Brother Golden had talked about the Euphrates River being diverted or blocked and allowing the soldiers to basically go in on dry land. The Euphrates did divide Babylon, run through Babylon, and like I say, most in the archaeological and scientific fields agree that that's the way they managed. And we talked about how back in those days that they didn't just go in and pick sides and do a battle. They would build siege mounds, they would surround, they would take whatever actions they needed to give them an advantage going in. So now that we're starting with chapter 6, well, before we start that, any questions or comments to this point? Okay. When we start with chapter 6, I find it to be an interesting but fairly easy to look at chapter. It starts out with Darius, and we'd also mentioned that this Darius was the one that was Gubaru. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. So as soon as they came in and captured the kingdom of Babylon, they decided that they was going to set up 120 princes. Who has a New King James Version? Satraps. Just another, we have to remember that when we're dealing with this on the interpretation, satraps, princes, governors, presidents, basically all of those just mean to a varying degree a level of official. We can't take it to mean like we do today. When we get to verse 2 and it talks about verse 3 talks about presidents. When we think of a president, what do we think about? The leader of the country. Well, here you have a king, or a couple of kings actually, the Medes and the Persians. So you've got two kings who are in control of the country, and he sets up 3 presidents. So what we need to look at that as is these 120 princes, basically they're setting up, ruling over a province like a state or a county, and the presidents that we get to, that is like cabinet level officials. There's 3 of them, and Daniel's going to be the noted one of the 3. But it says it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. So the presidents are set up, like I say, basically as a cabinet. The 120 princes report to them and get their, I guess you could call it their marching orders, their walking orders through them, and as long as they don't need the king to get involved, the king's going to stay out of it. And that's the way most good functional businesses work. You leave the decision making to the lowest level possible, and that way you don't take up the time of the head guy. But decision can't be made at that level, then it goes up a notch. And just as a side note, I have worked in both situations where they have left it to the lowest level and things work great. And I've also, in the military, was in one location where the colonel that was in charge of the unit tried to micromanage everything, and you couldn't do anything without his 2 cents worth, and generally things didn't work that well. And Brother Cox is smiling, so he's been in similar situations, right? So, but that was the basic organizational structure here, the way things were set up. And then it says, this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Now, what interaction had Cyrus or Darius had with Daniel so that they would know that he had an excellent spirit in him? Because all Daniel's actions up to this point basically had been with the Babylonians, and even Belshazzar didn't know anything about him.
I think word gets out of the things that he had done, dreams he had interpreted.
If they were smart, and I think they were, the best way to defeat your enemy is to know your enemy, and by them building blocking the Euphrates so they could go in, they had knowledge of the infrastructure, and they also had knowledge of history, knowing the people and knowing what was going on. It wasn't like they were in isolation. And that comes down to a point I'm going to try to make a little bit later, that I firmly believe that Darius, they knew what was going on, and they didn't have to see him in action. They knew his history and all. How old was Daniel at this point? If we surmise that he was a older teenager, somewhere in the 15 to 18 year range, if the kingdom of Babylon lasted approximately 70 years, how old is Daniel at this point? He's in his mid-80s, somewhere between, say, 83 and 86, or somewhere in that frame. So he's getting to be an old man. Verse 4 said, then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. Did they? Did the presidents? Well, 2 of them did. Sought occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, we shall not find an occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. You got to remember that Not everybody believed in the God of heaven. There was multiple gods at this point. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. Look at the first word of the next verse. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute. What's wrong with that statement to the king? Daniel wasn't included. Would it be safe to say that probably not all the people that are named by these people were in favor of what was going on? But the two that were plotting against Daniel said all. What were they? Well, let's read a little bit more and then I'll ask the question. And to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. There's multiple questions I have with this verse. The first one is, what emotion were they playing to on the king's part by saying all the counselors and governors and everything got together and want you to establish a royal statute that no one will ask anything of any god except you? Playing on his ego, playing on his pride. And apparently it worked because he didn't ask. You think Daniel was in his presence when they were making this statement? No. So the king knows that Daniel's not there, but when they say all the presidents, we've all gotten together and this is what we need to do, and played on his, as you say, his ego and his pride, he decides to do it. The second question I have is, why limit it to 30 days? Why didn't they just say, let's make this decree and go with it? I'm sorry? They only needed a little bit of time if their plan or plot was going to work. What else? What happens today a lot of times, especially in government and things? Let's try it. Let's give them a little bit of taste of this. How difficult is it to take something back once it has been given? If we just look at our recent history, why do we have today so many people unemployed, out of the workforce, not wanting to work, when there are signs plastered everywhere? And Andrea and I have even been to restaurants where we couldn't get seated because they didn't have enough staff to run the restaurant. Why is there, according to the reports, 80,000 shortages in the truck driving industry?
They've had a taste of free money.
They've had a taste of so-called free money. That money had to come from somewhere. Somebody paid for it. But it's most difficult if you try to take something back that you have given, even on a trial basis, because once they get a little bit of it, they want it all. Now, the third question is, why cast them into the lion's den? A little bit of background: the Medes and the Persians, one of their gods, they were worshipers of fire. Why didn't they put them in that fiery furnace that that the Babylonians had done before. Why go to the lion's den?
Slow down.
We're going to find out a little bit later it's not so slow for some folks. But I think Brother Jeremy said it right. It didn't work before. And if they knew the history of what was going on, why would you sit back and say, well, King, put them in a fiery furnace if they don't do this, when they knew that just a few years before, 3 had been put in that fiery furnace and it didn't work. So they're going to try a different tack. That's me and just surmising on a few things, but because there's no evidence one way or the other in Scripture, but seems to make sense to me. Questions, comments? Verse 8 then says, Now, O king, establish the decree, sign the writing, that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. So it was their law that once things were signed into law, that was it. Couldn't be changed. Verse 10, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. I think that phrase in there, as he did aforetime, was put in there very purposefully, because the question comes to mind, if Daniel, it said that when Daniel knew the writing was signed, does that mean that Daniel said, he signed that, so I'm going to be obstinate. I'm not going to obey it. Is that what it meant? Because of that phrase being put in there, as he did before time, Daniel knew the writing had been signed, but Daniel was not going to change his way. So he went into that house. The window was open, as windows were open back in those days for ventilation. And then he prayed 3 times facing Jerusalem, or the window toward Jerusalem, which was his custom. Now, the room that he went into his house, this chamber would have probably been in an upper portion of the building, because the way they constructed things back in those days, the lower level was the basic home unit, and special occasions and things were on the 2nd floor because there was better ventilation and it was more comfortable. Andrea and I have been in a situation where that has taken place. When we was in the Philippines in the early 70s, the congregation that we attended, we didn't go on base, we went downtown Angeles City, Philippines. It was a block building, and the lower floor, similar to here, only it wasn't a basement there, the lower floor was where they had fellowship meals, classes, and things of that nature. But the worship service was on the 2nd floor with rows of windows on both sides that was open for cross ventilation. Had no air conditioning. Philippines was about 100 degrees, give or take a degree. Humidity about 98%, give or take a percent of humidity. But it was relatively comfortable up there, even without air conditioning. So when I think of him going into his chamber and doing that, I think of things like that as to the whys.
It's also, that the people that were plotting against him, since that was his custom, and he did it with his windows open, they probably knew exactly what he was going to do.
There was, if they said the only way that we are going to find anything to accuse him of is through the law of his God, and they knew how faithful he was. They absolutely knew, and that's why they plotted it. And as Sister Mong said, when I asked the question about 30 days, didn't need long. They knew what was going to take place. Brother Golden, you had a hand going up there.
You mentioned about him not being obstinate. I think if he were going to be obstinate, he would have gone outside and done that and made it still.
He would have been to a more visible place if he was going to be making a show. But as that verse ended, he just did what he always did, and the plotters knew that, so they knew they was going to get him. Yes, ma'am.
Well, and I was going to say, we know this was his custom, but even if it hadn't been his custom, if this is the first time he'd ever done it, it still was the right thing. So it wouldn't have been a bad attitude or in the face of the law. It would have been, I'm obeying God. Even if it took that for him to finally realize, I got to do this, obviously.
So verse 11 then says, "And then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God." And this just goes to what Brother Day had said there, because when they assemble and found Daniel praying, they had to assemble within earshot. They knew where he lived. They knew his habits. So they just got there at the proper time to verify that he was going to do what they knew he was going to do. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. And they reminded him of what he had signed. "Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" And the king answered and said, "The thing is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not." Do you think the king is a little bit naive, at least to this point? They had played on his emotions. They had played up his ego. He had signed this thing. Now they came to him and asked him a simple question. "Didn't you just sign something?" "Well, yeah." They hadn't mentioned Daniel, and he hadn't got a clue. That's why I think he's a little naive on things to this point. And then they answered, and said to the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased. But I want you to pay attention to the next 2 words. With himself. Why was he displeased with himself at this point? And I think there's a very sound and logical reason that he was displeased with himself and not with those that had, we can't say tricked, we'll just say used him. Who was at fault? Were the ones that brought the message to him and asked him to do it, were they at fault?
Yes. To a point.
To a point, but who had the ultimate responsibility?
The final say was his. He made the law.
And he didn't check things out. He just took their word. So that, to me, is why he was displeased with himself, is because he let those people use him. He was gullible at that point.
It shows a certain amount of character that he has. You know, so often when we get tempted into something, or, you know, maybe there's a bad influence and we make the wrong decision, it's easy to blame that person or that temptation rather than actually pointing that finger back at yourself.
you are right, and the rest of that verse just builds on that, because it said, after he was displeased with himself, set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. King's in a box right now. He's the king. He has to show strength. Even though he signed a law or a decree that he's sorry he signed, didn't want to sign it, wanted it changed because he labored till sundown to try to find a way out of the situation with Daniel. He still had to obey the law that he signed, even though he didn't want to. So,
it's not like the politicians today. You have no wiggle room. No wiggle room at all.
sorry?
One other thing to consider is, like most politicians even today, the people who brought this before him were all master manipulators. And more than likely chose their time period when he was not really paying attention or had already received a large list of other demands that he needed to take care of, all this stuff. So it would be like, the end of your day, oh, one more thing, just sign here. They did it on purpose. They knew what they were doing. And he just wasn't happy with himself because he allowed it to happen.
Well, that is quite evident even in today's society, because if you watch much news on TV, and I'm not talking about pick out your favorite channel, the one that always agrees with you or you always agree with them, but if you look at everything that's going on, how many times will they go in and ask somebody their opinion of something that has been done by somebody, and it's good. But then when they tell them who did it, it's bad. Wait a minute now. Why was it good here, but this person did it and now it's bad? So they allow themselves to be used without really looking at things. But here he goes on and says, then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed. He had worked all afternoon trying to figure out a way around it. But these evil people kept prodding him and saying, you got to do it this way. Is that reminiscent of anything to you in the New Testament? What happened with Pilate? Pilate found no fault in Christ. Pilate found no guilt. Pilate wanted to release Christ, but what did the chief priests and Pharisees and others do? Wanted Barabbas. We want you to crucify Christ, but I find no fault in him. Well, if you don't crucify him, there's going to be an uprising. Uh-oh. Pilate can't make Caesar mad. Pilate's got to go along with the mob. So this is sort of what's going on here. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. This king worshiped pagan gods, worshiped, like I say, one of theirs was fire. He had to have known the history of Daniel in Babylon, or else he could not make that statement that Daniel's God would deliver him. And then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, and the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. Wanted to make sure that Daniel was in that den, make sure that it had the signature on it. Is that also reminiscent of what they did when they rolled the stone over the tomb of Christ and placed the guards around it. Then the king went to his palace, passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. This goes back to what Brother Jeremy Day said, that even though he had done all of this and he was sorry for it, he was now trying to make amends. And this goes to his character. Yes, he had an ego, but also he wanted to try to do what was right, at least in this area right here. So he didn't sleep all night and fasted. Arose very early in the morning, went in haste into the lion's den, and when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel, and the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lion's den? Question of speculation. Do you think the king thought he would hear Daniel's voice? He had just said, your God will save you. Yes, ma'am.
There may be some ambiguity in the original, because the ESV phrases it as like a request. May your God deliver you. So
Okay.
it may have been I really want this, but obviously he didn't firmly believe it, or he wouldn't have spent such a torn up night about it.
Well, there you go. If he had really believed it, he would have said it and let it go, right? But
People who are assured in their beliefs don't lament.
But the question was to Daniel.
question was to Daniel, and then verse 21, Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. Can you imagine the relief in the king's voice when he heard Daniel? Not that he was praising him and saying live forever, but just he heard his voice. My God hath sent his angel and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before him an innocence was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the lion's den, into the den of lions. Them, their children, their wives. Is that retaliation or justice going on? A little bit of both. Tells me don't make the king mad.
And an example for the future.
Example for the future. And that was the custom of the time, that they would not only take the guilty party, they would take and destroy families. We can even go back into the book of Exodus and see that happen. So, and then Brother Cox had made the mention that they'd put him in the lion's den because it would be a slow death instead of the fiery furnace, which would be a fast death. But look what it says. The lions had the mastery of them, and break all their bones in pieces wherever they came at the bottom of the den. They didn't even make it to the floor of the den before they were done in. Well, yeah, they had fasted all night with Daniel in there, right? Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, languages that dwell in the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who had delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So, if we take that to mean that Daniel prospered through the reign of Cyrus, that would be an additional 7 years from where we were talking about. So that puts Daniel somewhere in the 90s, 92, 93 age range. It doesn't say that he lived all the way through theirs. It just said he prospered during their in their reign. So you can take that any way you want to look at it. Questions or comments on Brother Clunch?
As the section begins, he talks about he's put Daniel and these other people over the various parts of the kingdom so that there would be no damage to the king. I think it's interesting that when you get to the scene as far as verse 22, Daniel says to the king, I've done you no hurt. As if to say, me serving God hasn't hurt you politically or caused you any damage financially or whatever materially to the kingdom. I think maybe a play on words, because he says lions haven't hurt me, but I haven't hurt you either.
I think that's a fair statement. I think that was a gentle chastisement of the king at this point. Yeah, you went along with these people. You signed this decree to do this to me. I hadn't bothered you in any way. So, good point. Good point.
At the middle of verse 26, do you think this was forecasting the coming of the Christian age?
You talking about where he says, yeah, we can go to Psalms and Luke on yeah. As a matter of fact, if we go over into the book of Hebrew, when we get into chapter 11 about the faith, when we get on down there, it talks about all the people that were prophesying and shutting the mouth of the lions and things of that nature. So there's, can't recall right offhand where that is, but maybe, hang on a second.
But I thought it was kind of unique that Darius wrote that.
Yes, sir. Go to Hebrews chapter 11. I believe it's somewhere around 30. Now, a little farther down. Let's start with 32. And what shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah, of David also and Samuel, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. So there's your connection with that, or where I was going to. So I guess our time is up. The bell rang. Thank y'all so much for your questions, comments, and attention.